My name's Veronica Strang, and I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Study in Durham, and so I get the very pleasurable task of welcoming you all to our annual London event. And of course, I'd like to begin by thanking Michael Itzer and the ICAEW for their tremendous generosity in supporting the IAS by providing this very wonderful venue for our panel discussion this evening. The IAS is blessed with a number of keen supporters who are very enthused by the idea that an institute, it is, to use a very apposite phrase for this evening, very blue sky, in that we foster interdisciplinary research that stretches right across the whole disciplinary spectrum. And as some of you know, the IAS is Durham University's flagship research institute. Each year, we bring international scholars from around the world to collaborate with each other and with Durham researchers on our annual research theme. And in fact, some of our previous fellows are right here in the audience. And this year, of course, our theme has been light. And it's been a fantastic year for exciting research. We've fostered projects on optical technologies, lantern festivals, underwater luminescence, on the physics of light, light, vision and emotion, to name but a few. And we've had physicists, artists, marine biologists and chemists working on a joint art project that responds to light. A little interdisciplinary discussion on lighthouses generated so much enthusiasm that we're now editing a written research conversation with a completely unmanageable number of contributors. And my co-directors and I are very fortunate to be able to look after an institute that is not only producing many exciting research outcomes and events, but is also intellectually a lot of fun. So if you'd like to know more about what we do and participate in our activities, you're very welcome indeed to join our mailing list, Twitter feeds, etc. And the details, of course, are on leaflets here and, of course, on our website. But for the moment, we are looking at our next year in terms of themes, and our next year's theme is emergence, which is going to bring some very exciting fellows to work on that and to give public lectures, etc. But our moment, it was continuing to gaze into the light at present, and in true IS style have brought you a very interdisciplinary panel. I'll let our panel chair introduce them to you, but I will introduce him. Professor Martin Ward, on my right here, is Durham's Temple Chevalier Chair of Astronomy and was previously head of our physics department. And he's an observational astrophysicist, a consultant for the European Space Agency, and he's involved in the Next Generation Hubble Telescope project. And his research is rather a counterpoint to this evening's discussion, being concerned with black holes and dark matter. Indeed, in Durham, he's rather fondly known as the Prince of Darkness. So I'm going to hand you over to him to introduce our panel to you, and I hope very much that you will not only enjoy the panel discussion, but that you will dive into it with some lovely questions and so forth. So, Martin.
Thank you, Veronica. I'm only going to stand up for the initial moment because I have to make a couple of announcements, and it's easier standing up. After that, I shall sit down and we will be an informal panel. The first announcement is what to do if there's a fire. Apparently, no fire alarms are scheduled, so this is not a drill if one goes off. If one goes off, you can leave by that exit, and if that happens and you go that way, go right, and hopefully you'll end up in Whalebourne Court. If you want to go that way, you go left out of the main doors. So that's done. The other thing I need to note, and you can see here, is that we are being filmed, both video and audio, and after the panel has had their discussion, we will take audience questions, and that will be part of this procedure. And the final thing is, I'm reliably informed that the answer is 0-0, so you didn't miss much. So, a word about what we hope to do to offer you the audience, which is, of course, very important because you outnumber us by a very large factor. By any standards, lights in the sky with the subtext of the search for meaning is a very ambitious topic. But we have a very distinguished group of luminaries here that are up for the challenge. As Veronica said, I'm the opposite. Black holes, dark energy. She didn't mention the third one, dark matter, dark energy, but that's my bit, so I won't be a luminary. I shall just be a master of ceremonies. I'll shortly invite the panel here to introduce themselves and their areas of interest. But in essence, they represent what Durham IAS, that's the Institute for Advanced Study, stands for. And that is an interdisciplinary perspective with the aim to transform the way we think. So, as they will tell you shortly, one is a professional astronomer, amongst many other things. One is a theologian who has 2 PhDs, but only 1 brain, as far as we know. We have a classicist who is an expert in ancient Greek and Roman world, and an anthropologist. So a completely eclectic bunch, which is really what this is about. What we want to do is to tap this wealth of knowledge and experience, but to put aside the specialist language or the baggage, which sometimes gets in the way. And what we want to get out of this is to comment and discuss the topics in an intellectual but an accessible interdisciplinary way. Now, many of you have degrees, or more than 1 degree, and many of you don't. Some of you don't. I see some young people here. This is great. So our aim is to be accessible to all of the audience. And we're not going to be dealing with the nuts and bolts of how stars work, refraction and scattering effects in rainbows, fascinating although that is. What we really want to explore are the deeper influences on cultural beliefs and practices, making comparisons between times and places. And towards the end, we may get onto Ufos, if time permits. I'm now going to ask the panel to introduce themselves briefly. From my right here, Jocelyn.
Thank you. I'm Jocelyn Burnell. I am, or was, a professional astronomer. I have worked right across the spectrum, except with light. So I'm not sure what I'm doing here. My research interests have been neutron stars, but I also have interests outside astronomy. I collect poetry with an astronomical theme. I am passionate about getting more women into science and engineering, and I'm an active Quaker.
Hello, I'm Bob Layton. I'm the anthropologist. I've done fieldwork in rural France looking at social change. I spent 7 years in Australia working with Aboriginal communities, looking at Aboriginal art and working on Aboriginal land rights and land claims. And the last few years I've been working in China with 2 institutions there, looking at the revival of traditional Chinese arts and culture after the Cultural Revolution and the return of the market economy. And I'm going to talk about Australia tonight. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Serafina Cuomo, and I am the ancient historian. I teach ancient history here in London at Birkbeck. My main area of research is the history of science in ancient Greece and Rome. The reason why I think it's fascinating is that people in antiquity around the Mediterranean basically looked at the same things as we do today. They looked at the skies, but they saw completely different things from us. So I'm interested, I'm very curious about how knowledge changes through history and how different societies, different cultures produce different types of science and of knowledge. Also, I'm a big sci-fi fan, so I hope we do get to the Ufos question.
Good evening, my name's David Wilkinson. I'm principal of one of Durham's colleges, St. John's College. And I was thinking about how to introduce myself and remembered an incident when I was travelling down on a train from Durham. Sat down beside someone and they introduced themselves and said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I'm a theologian at Durham University." I was hesitant about saying that to people because you never quite know what people's reaction will be. And this man's eyes seemed to fill with fear as he thought to himself, "Oh no, all the way to London sitting beside this God fanatic." So he quickly tried to change the topic of conversation. He said, "What did you do before that?" Well, I said, "I did research in theoretical astrophysics." This time, his eyes glazed. And yet he said, in a startled way, "Well, how do you hold the two together?" And partly that's my interest, is exploring the dialogue between scientific ideas and theological ideas. Recently, in 2 particular ways. One, picking up on Martin's interest in dark energy and the futility of the long-term future of the universe and what that might mean for religious thought. and the other in the area of the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, which is, at the moment, one of the really interesting scientific areas of development, with the discovery of planets all of the time, and asking the question, what does that mean for religious belief and cultural change? Lots of people believe that if you find intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, then all the faith communities will need to close down in some kind of way. So the reality is very different, and those are my interests.
Very good. So you've met the cast, and now we should put them to work. So I'm going to start off with the first area for discussion with a quote from Oscar Wilde. It's a rather famous quote from Lady Windermere's Fan play, and that is, "We're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking up at the stars." Well, fortunately, it isn't a required location, the gutter. We can look at the stars from anywhere. So the first topic to explore is, I'm going to ask the panel one by one and to chip in as they wish, when they look up at the sky, and by that I mean in the broadest terms, not necessarily the night sky, although it could be a rainbow that they're looking at, or a comet, or the aurora, or anything like that. What thoughts and emotions does it engender? Jocelyn.
I think the first thing that comes to me is when we try to look at the night sky in southern England, we see remarkably little of it. And that is a real shame. And it means that there are generations of children who haven't really seen a night sky. And when they go away on school excursions, one of the things they have to be shown when they're out in the country is the night sky. But I've just been in New Zealand on a lecture tour. It's winter there, of course, and there are long nights. Some nights the weather is lousy, but some nights it's fine. And the southern sky is even more spectacular than ours at the best. It's truly wonderful and amazing. And also a strange place, because I don't recognize the constellations. So it's unfamiliar, but amazing.
I guess they're upside down.
The ones that you're meant to recognize are upside down, yes.
Yes. Yes, what you say about southern England reminds me, some years ago there was a massive power cut in North America, wasn't there? And apparently people were phoning the emergency service to say there were strange lights in the sky. It was the first time they'd ever seen stars. But as Jocelyn says, in the southern hemisphere, you have a much better view of the night sky, not just because the skies are much clearer, but also because you're looking towards the center of our galaxy, so the Milky Way is much brighter. And the thing that I really think of is camping out in the Australian bush, as I did on a number of occasions, and I had this sense that I was stuck to the ceiling of the universe on the Earth, looking down into this immense void of stars, and gravity could cut off at any minute and I would tumble infinitely down into this space just filled with a myriad of stars. And it was a wonderful feeling, although slightly alarming at times.
It's funny that actually Jocelyn should mention childhood and experiences and memories, because when I started thinking about lights in the sky because of this event, my first memory was actually a childhood experience. When we were around 8, 9, my brother and I, my uncle took us and my cousins to see the meteor showers in the night between the 9th and the 10th of August, the night of St. Lawrence. And it was very exciting because we weren't usually allowed to spend half the night outside on the side of a mountain. And I must say it was probably the first time I actually looked at the night sky. Positively observing, because we were so keen to see a meteor, because then we were told if you see one you can make a wish and the wish will come true. So this sense of wonder, but also sudden realization that there's this whole world out there and I never even noticed it.
I was one of these city kids and so never saw the night sky, but the image that stays with me, or the series of images, were those images from the Apollo missions of looking back from the moon to the Earth. And I remember thinking at that point, there's something here about who I am as a human being, some sense of perspective have seen the whole Earth encapsulated in one image. And then I was taken out. I grew up in the northeast, and long before we had an observatory at Kielder Reservoir, and even before it had all developed, been taken out into one of the darkest places in Britain, to Kielder, and the impact, again, of the sense of the vastness of the universe, 100 billion stars, 100 billion galaxies, not being able to see all of them, but those that I could see were just incredible. And that sense of perspective, or the question of who I am as a human being, was very important. And that led on, I think, to a deep curiosity about what's it all about, not just the universe, but my place in it. And underlying that was this emotional sense of awe, I think. We talk about it a lot as scientists. We know that science most of the time is very boring, it's very tedious, it's research grants and PhD students who won't do what they tell you to do and all the rest of it, but ultimately there's that deep sense of moments where one just goes, gosh, wow. And that was part of my response to the lights in the sky.
I have a friend who does not like me talking about the size, the scale. He says it makes him feel too small, too insignificant. And so that's a topic where we just don't go. Have others had that sense that actually it's too spacious?
I have the phobia of images of open space. I know, and I think it's because they really give you the sense that you're falling into a void. So yeah, I can't have that on my screensaver on the computer. Sorry.
I remember a startling moment once. We were on a French campsite, and I came out of the men's shower block, and a meteorite, bright green and sparkling, shot across the sky and burnt out. And I thought, did I see that? And then I heard a woman in front of a tent call to her husband, "Vous avez vu ça?" And yes, I did see it. It wasn't my imagination.
So maybe the fear of open space is to do with coming from caves or something. We need a psychologist or some psychiatrist or something to tell us that. The other, just to explore it a little bit further, if you look at things through a small telescope, I know some of us are professional astronomers, and of course they don't look through big telescopes. You never do that these days. You have equipment, spectrographs or whatever. But when you look at things through a pair of binoculars or telescope, has it got the same effect, or is it kind of diminished in some way? Anybody want to pick that up?
I've had such trouble getting the binoculars to work with my varifocal glasses that we won't go there.
No, I agree. I think some of the technicalities of looking at the universe are really quite difficult. The amazing thing about technology today is the way that it's represented to us, with artificial colours often, which is a very different way of looking at the universe to what you get through a telescope or binoculars. You get a glimpse of things, but it's very different when you see the Hubble images presented in such a clear and fantastic way.
We should perhaps remember that the eye is an optical instrument, although it's sort of glued into our brain. It is just like a telescope, effectively. Right, well, I think perhaps we'll move on to a slightly different topic, and that is diverse cultures see some of the same lights in the sky. They see rainbows, comets, the Milky Way. But as we've already mentioned, to us, and it's all a matter of relativity, the constellations are upside down. If you're in the northern hemisphere, you go to the southern hemisphere. Orion is there walking across the sky sideways. The center of our galaxy we don't see from the northern hemisphere, at least not this bit of the northern hemisphere. So the question is this: how do these different perspectives reflect or reinforce cultural beliefs? The signs, how are they interpreted as deities? How do they have influence on humankind? And we may eventually stray into astrology, but I don't want it to be a sort of slanging match between those that believe in astrology and those that don't. It's more to do with the influence of astrology. Serafina, would you like to start on that?
Yes, I think one perspective that the ancient societies I've looked at share with us when they looked at the lights in the sky is the realization that the universe is a cosmos, to use the Greek word. The Greek word cosmos at its heart has two concepts, beauty and order. So there is some regularity in the universe, and there is beauty, and the two things kind of depend on each other. Because of this beauty and this regularity, most ancient societies that I've looked at also developed the idea that the heavens are eternal. They're almost immortal, if we think in terms of life, and they're not exactly made of the same matter as things on Earth. Aristotle thought, for instance, that there was a fifth element. He wasn't the first one to come up with it, but he has a very detailed argument that the element in the heavens is not like the elements on Earth. So all this was, if you like, combined to make the heavens divine. And the regularities in the heavens were signs from the gods. In Mesopotamian terms, because obviously among the ancient societies around the Mediterranean, one of the greatest contributions came from Mesopotamian. The Mesopotamian astronomers thought that the heavens were basically heavenly writing. It was like a canvas on which the gods had written in such a way that if deciphered correctly, humans could understand what the message from the gods was. So there is a sense in which the heavens are special, but there is also, if you like, a profound rationality because the decoding of that message is often done with mathematics, with observations, with systematicity.
And certainly the Judeo-Christian tradition would recognize that order and that beauty and reflect on what that told people about the nature of God. So many of the Psalms pick up the beauty and the extravagance of the universe and reflect on God's creative work. There would still be an element of creation in that. One of the interesting things also is the way that these cultures reacted to the unusual in the skies. The comet appearing. And so Halley's Comet, for example, we've got Chinese records and then Babylonian observations of it every 76, 75 years. And comets themselves were interpreted in different ways as signs, as portents from the gods, and interpreted. So the unusual, the breaking of the order, that which you didn't expect, also had religious implications and interpretations to it, and the two often needed to be held together in some way.
Yes, yes. I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity around the comets, precisely because obviously they're in the heavens, or are they? Because, for instance, according to Aristotle, they actually are phenomena that happen below the heavens, so they're not really, they're more terrestrial, well, atmospheric phenomena. But at the same time, there's also a very strong need to understand what they mean as signs. And I think there's an ambiguity in that sometimes they're seen as a bad thing, sometimes they're seen as a good thing. So within a certain framework, there's also a lot of space for, if you like, flexibility that then corresponds to what the political or religious needs of the time may have been.
So it didn't sort of evolve from being at one time a bad portent to then being a good thing. It was depending on the context of what it was.
Completely, yeah. Yes.
But that's still true today. Apparitions of comets, in particular, unexpected ones. We know when Halley's coming pretty well. But unexpected comets, which is probably the majority of them, people predicting the end of the world regularly. And it's quite deeply embedded. The word disaster is dis-aster, aster star.
Right. Yeah.
And apparently also flu, influenza, is under the influence of the stars. So if you don't understand what something bad is, blame it on the stars.
The Aboriginal case is interesting, because whether you know about the dreaming tracks, as they're called, and the sacred sites in the land, the focus of Aboriginal religion is on the land and the way that the ancestral beings who crossed the landscape created sacred sites that contain the spirits of unborn children. They're always, or nearly always, water sources that belong to particular clans, and only members of that clan have the right to go there. And then you have the dreaming tracks of the ancestors that link clans in a chain across the land. So it's an interesting question for me. Why are Aboriginal people interested in the stars? Because you can't protect them in the way you can protect a sacred site. You can't go there. Nobody can go to these stars. It seems to me that there are two things, two possible answers to this. One is that the stars represent legends that are equally important to everyone. And the second is that after completing their travels, some ancestors went into the sky where everyone can see them after they created the sacred sites of particular clans. The other thing that interests me is that Aboriginal people see different patterns in the constellations that we recognize. And it's a salutary reminder that there are many different, equally convincing ways of seeing patterns in the stars. And I have got
Yes, go ahead.
a picture here of the Milky Way. And for people in the Kimberleys, northwest Australia, the supreme being, and it's unusual in Australia to have a supreme being, the supreme being, Najaya, told the ancestors of the clans to mark out the territories, and then he went up into the Milky Way to watch what they were doing. And you can see, I hope, his shadow there in the Milky Way. And when boys are initiated, they're taken out into the bush where they lie on the ground at night, and some more details of this legend, of what he's holding particularly, explained to them. The Southern Cross is seen as a fighting boomerang. A fighting boomerang has a hook on the end, so when you throw it, when you're fighting, your opponent will hold a parrying stick up, and the end of the boomerang hooks on the stick and swings around and strikes you on the temple. And some of the people, dead people in my family trees that I collected, were people who'd been killed by a fighting boomerang one time or another. The point about the fighting boomerang is it actually is also associated with the legend of the Milky Way and the morning and evening star, but it is a lesson that you will be severely punished if you don't marry correctly. And everyone has to follow the marriage rules. So it's equally applicable to
I must say the
everyone.
fighting boomerang is much more convincing than the Southern Cross.
Well, I think
Missing a little bit.
it uses more stars, and it doesn't complete the fourth side of the cross. And of course, as you commented to me the other day, there's no central point in the Southern Cross, whereas the way it's represented in the Southern Cross flag, they actually add a fifth star, a spurious star. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to explore a bit more with anybody, Serafina perhaps, how these ideas change with time, because obviously they come from somewhere. They don't spontaneously emerge as myths and legends and associations with deities. They arise. But once they've arisen, do they stay immutable or do they change?
No, also because ancient astronomers, at least as far as Greece and Rome were concerned, were quite a competitive bunch. So most of them would criticize their predecessors when they wrote something. So you had to change something. They were very careful to acknowledge debts. There's a real sense that they are standing on their predecessors' shoulders, so to speak. But at the same time, almost everybody will criticize what their predecessors have said in order to make their own point. And one area where you find a lot of little changes and tweakings is what is known as the Star Catalogue, so the list of constellations, which have a mythological flavor, but we also have, interestingly, some open admissions that the mythological structure of the constellations is also a mnemonic device. I was reading a Greek poet this morning, Aratus, a Hellenistic poet, And he basically says no one could list all the stars one by one. So grouping them in constellations is basically a way of remembering them and then being able to give an account of them. But each one of them has got slight differences as to where they put the end of one constellation, the beginning of another, the magnitude, for instance. So that's one area where there is change even within antiquity.
And mythological interpretations build upon one another and sometimes are in opposition to one another. So the Babylonian story, Enuma Elish, and Genesis 1 account, there's some commentators who would argue that Genesis has taken the Babylonian account and embodied it. There are other commentators who argue that Genesis is a polemic against other ancient myths. And this is very interesting and complicated. And often we simplify it too much. There seems to be a much more organic relationship between these myths and building on one and saying, I'm not like that one, explicitly.
There's certainly a number of alternative interpretations of the Milky Way in different parts of Aboriginal Australia. There's the emu, shadow of the emu is seen spread across the Milky Way in central Western Australia. But they don't come into conflict because they're hundreds of miles apart.
There's lots of lovely names given to the Milky Way by people in different parts of the world who were much more conscious of the night sky than we are today. I think my favorite one is Thailand, where the Milky Way translates as the way of the white elephant. And in New Zealand, Maori, it's the long fish. And in Setswana, in South Africa, it's the place where the lightning rests. And you probably know that in Spain and in the Basque Country, it's the road to Santiago de Compostela. All sorts of lovely names for it.
I might add a comment about constellations we talked about a few minutes ago. It's a modern thing as well. We have something called the International Astronomical Union, a sort of, union for, as in TUC, union for astronomers. And they decide on constellations. They have votes and panels and things. And they do come and go. And I think a few hundred years ago, you may remember the name, one was lost. Or demoted.
Yeah, the ship, Argo.
Yes, that's right.
Argo.
Because it was too big to fit on some of the charts or something, or the books of the time. So it's a very pragmatic thing, and I don't want to go on because I'm not one of the panelists, but maybe one of the astronomers would like to comment on the ephemeral nature of constellations and why that's the case.
Some of them actually are very durable. Orion, for instance, you find in several cultures because it's pretty obvious. And the Pleiades as well, often described as the Seven Sisters. But otherwise...
yes, I'd like to come back to that, but maybe not now, later, whatever you wish.
Oh, please do.
Well, the really interesting thing about the Pleiades is that there is, in fact, a legend in Central Australia, the legend of the Kunkarangkalpa, which means the group of young women who are the Pleiades, flew up into the sky at the end of their journey, and they were pursued by a man who wanted to rape the oldest sister, the Cuckoo Man, and he pursued them across the landscape, and you can trace their tracks in sacred sites, stone formations, rock shelters, and so forth. And then when they got to the south coast of Australia, the sisters plunged into the sea, and they were so shocked by the cold that they flew up into the Pleiades. And Orion's belt and sword is the footprint of Wadi Nuru, the Cuckoo Man, still pursuing him. So the three stars of his belt represent his toes, and the sword represents his heel. And it's an intriguing and fascinating question as to why you should get this parallelism. My initial thought, when I found out that this myth also existed in ancient Greece, is it must be so old that it had some common origin, but that is just inconceivable because Aboriginal people have been in Australia for 50 or 60,000 years, if not longer. So it does seem that, well, the obvious solution to part of it is that as the stars move across the sky, Orion pursues the Pleiades, so it has some kind of intrinsic naturalness.
And never catches them.
And never catches them, exactly.
Yep.
But why the Pleiades should be seen as a group of young women in ancient Greece and in Aboriginal Australia is harder to explain, and I think it's just...
Just to be flippant for a moment, of course, the Japanese turned it into a car called Subaru,
Yes. Yeah.
as you can see
Right.
from the motif.
Yes, yeah.
The thing about the ephemeral nature of the constellations I was really getting at was the fact that the stars are all doing their own thing, and it's a projection onto the celestial sphere. We call them a particular constellation. They're not in the same place. They're moving at different speeds. So if you hang around long enough, they will look completely different depending on their velocities.
Yeah.
And also, if you go to a different star away from our sun, they will look different again. It's all perspective. So it is rather a sort of a narrow view of the universe, perhaps you could say. I'd like to explore a little bit more with the panel the ways in which modern science may have impacted our view of some specific objects. So when Galileo turned his crude telescope on the sun and discovered it had spots, the influence that had on the religious beliefs of the time. And, well, perhaps we'll do that first. I have another example. But
I mean, it picks up on an earlier point about how mythologies and worldviews get codified. And, of course, what happened as the church got involved was that Thomas Aquinas famously took Aristotelian cosmology and said, this is how the universe is, and it became the bedrock of Roman Catholic theological development, the church's theological development. What Galileo did was, through observation, to say that philosophical basis needs to be superseded by observation. Sunspots were important because they showed that these astronomical objects weren't as perfect as the philosophers would have said. The moons of Jupiter became important because they gave a model to think in a different kind of way. And so observation, and particularly the use of, as you said, Martin, the telescope, to begin to see those things that you can't immediately see from the ground, was a major turning point, it seems to me. The story of Galileo, I think, again, is very complex. And the battle between science and the church, I think, is often overplayed. This was a battle between how you did science, what was dominant, philosophy or observation. And in fact, one of the few places where we know that Galileo was specifically criticized was in a sermon preached by Tommaso Cassini, who took a verse from the beginning of Acts, which goes, you men of Galilee, why look you to the heavens? And Cassini used it as a wordplay to criticize Galileo. And he was saying, why try and work out the universe by looking at the heavens? That's not primarily the way you do it. But it did become codified, and the Aristotelian universe became a very, very strong model, which eventually had to be overturned.
And of course, the same thing happened with Newton's discovery of the spectrum, didn't it? That when he discovered that white light could be broken up into a series of wavelengths, I don't suppose he called them wavelengths, but you know what I mean, colours. This was very shocking to many people because they thought of white light as being pure rather than made up of a number of different combinations. In fact, he decided that the reason it looked white was because it was like a musical scale, and there were 7 bands of colour as there were 7 notes in the musical scale. And he could only see 6, so he called in a friend, apparently, and asked him to stick pins in the spectrum where the bands were most marked. And they coined the word indigo, I believe, at that point, to create a 7th colour band in order to save, as far as possible, the notion of white light as being pure and harmonious.
Interesting, that number 7. Because the Pleiades are the 7 sisters.
Yes.
And yet, if you look at the Pleiades, there are 5. Maybe 2 have faded, or maybe they kind of projected 7 onto the cluster. 7 days of the week. And
Yes.
So colour is another very interesting aspect, but I think we may get slightly off the topic.
Sure.
Just to give a plug, we do have a group of us in Durham who are working, or interdisciplinary work, on the topic of colour. So it's a very interesting topic on its own. So the other example I had is really moving hundreds of years ahead of Galileo, and it concerns the moon. We haven't talked about the moon, but in terms of lights in the sky, it's pretty important, light in the sky. And so we can look at it in various ways, but one particular theme I wanted to do, which is in relation to modern science and the effect, is that we've been to the moon. We've been there, we've done that. And so in terms of modern-day perceptions of the moon, I don't just mean Western, I mean elsewhere as well, maybe indigenous populations, current-day indigenous populations. Has it had an effect that we've been there and set foot?
Not to my knowledge in Aboriginal Australia, no. No.
Is that because it's a non-question or because they don't believe it happened?
Well, to be honest, I've never asked them, and no one has ever said to me, what's all this rubbish about people going to the moon? No, it's, I think it's a non-question.
But it is true in some areas of the world, I think the Muslim world, for example, there are subsections of society that absolutely don't believe that we've been to the moon. It's all a Hollywood hoax. And in fact, I think people in America, some of them believe that as well. I hope nobody here believes it. But if you do, talk about it afterwards with me. Yeah.
We may get onto this later, but one of the books I've got down here is Carl Jung, Flying Saucers. Do you know Carl Jung wrote about flying saucers? One of the stories in this he relates is somebody who claimed to be abducted and taken on a UFO round the backside of the moon, which we never see. We only ever see one face of the moon. And apparently he said the backside of the moon was heavily forested with rivers and mountains and lakes.
And when was that book written?
1937, I
So
think.
it was well before the Cold War then.
There was beginnings of, no, sorry, first published 1959.
That's perfect.
That's better, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, of course, that person will have looked very stupid when we sent a satellite round the back of the moon, so that it's a bit like the front of the moon, unsurprisingly.
But I don't know whether David or others might want to comment on this, but we were talking about Galileo and the battle between the people that wanted things to be perfect, didn't want the sun to have spots, and the people in a different context who don't want people to have been to the moon. Do you think there is any similarity there?
I'm not too sure, Martin. I mean, Galileo, of course, did notice cratering and looked at it closely with his telescope, but we can see that. And again, it just posed the question about the imperfection in the universe. I am fascinated why there are folk around today who deny that we visited the moon. I think it raises the power of the media for me, which we may come on to, that the media has its own mythology. It tells its own stories. There's one or two science fiction movies that have played the "we never went to the moon, it's all done in a television studio." And we neglect the power of those stories at our peril, I think. They do shape public attitudes. And there's some very simple science to do that we can talk about and show that it's very clear that we visited the moon. But the power of story starts to undercut some of the scientific facts, as we'd say.
Is that because we scientists don't have enough stories ourselves to tell? Or we don't present our stuff as stories?
I think that's
so
right. Yes.
Stories of any sort overwhelm the scientific facts.
I think, of course, we do tell stories all of the time, but we probably don't recognise it, or we don't recognise the power of communicating stories in a way that's accessible. Einstein, in relativity, told lots of stories, from twin paradoxes to others, to communicate the very difficult mathematics. And he was great at that popularisation. And there are distinguished popularisers around, yourself included, I may say. But the power of story and telling the story is of immense value, and we don't do it enough, I think.
I think we've underestimated it. And I think it's one thing that maybe women are more conscious of than men.
Yes.
It's interesting, actually, in Aboriginal Australia, that the legends are true. There's no concept of a made-up story. The notion of fiction is not part of Aboriginal culture. But I was just reminded there, I was a PhD student during the first moon landing, and the girlfriend of a fellow student was working in an old people's home, and she said she and an elderly lady were watching the moon landing on television, and just as the astronaut came down the steps from the module, the old lady said, "Say what you like, they'll never put a man on the moon." Go, but that's happening now. I don't care what you say. They'll never do it.
Yeah, we probably explore that. I think there's obviously a political element to this as well.
I was going to say
in the
that.
areas that are not inclined to believe it. But I was looking a bit deeper to see whether there was some resonance with the fact that we've been there, we've somehow contaminated it by our presence. So people might not wish to believe it.
But
Yes.
I think the political element is crucial here. I mean, since antiquity, looking at the heavens has also been used as, if you like, for political propaganda. So astrology in the Roman world boomed in the 1st century BC when the Emperor Augustus decided to advertise his horoscope, which unsurprisingly predicted that he would become emperor. And I think in the reaction of many, this belief that some people have regarding the moon landing is mixed up with the feelings they may have towards the USA, the perceived American imperialism, the context of the Cold War, the race to the moon, the fact that this I think the political aspect cannot be separated. I mean, it's naive to think that science on that scale can be done without political implications.
All right, I think we agree on that. So I'd like to move on. We will get to UFOs in a few minutes, but let's just think about one other thing, and that is supernovae. We know about what they are. I think most people do. Exploding stars. They're very bright. We're actually due for one. By that I mean statistically. In our own galaxy, we can do the calculations on star duration of life and the masses of stars. So what I'd like to ask the panel is, what do they think would be the effect if a supernova went off? And it would be dramatic. It would happen sort of within minutes. One minute it's there, it's not there, the next minute it is there. And it could be as bright, 10 times as bright as Venus. Do you think this would have a big impact, or people just say, well, something else?
Well, if it's within 25 light years, yes. It's probably curtains for humanity. Because along with the blast of light, there's a lot of X-rays and gamma rays. Fortunately, we don't know of any more stars within 25 light years that are likely to go supernova. Betelgeuse in Orion is the nearest, but it's about 65 light years away. We are, however, within, I think it's 3 different bubbles, 3 remains of 3 different supernovae that clearly have gone off nearby, but billions of years back.
That's an effect, a physical effect, which of course will be very dramatic, but I'm thinking more of a psychological effect. Do you think it would have a dramatic effect, or people say, seen it in the movies,
It would have to be as bright as the full moon before people noticed. I think.
Really?
A bit brighter than Venus. Some people will register, but, it's amazing how little people sometimes notice the night sky. Oh, the moon was this funny shape. Oh my God, it happens every month.
It also depends on whether it's cloudy in Britain, I suppose, at the time as well, and often supernovas have a few weeks timescale of decline, and so you might miss it simply because it's too cloudy. Going back to Galileo, one of the interesting things in the story that moved from Copernicus through to Galileo was Tycho Brahe's observation of a supernova explosion, and his ability to say that again shows that the universe is not made up of these crystalline spheres in simple revolution. And so supernovae have changed our whole perception of the universe. And indeed, it was supernova observations that caused us to begin to speculate about dark energy only a couple of decades ago. Very distant supernovas that allowed us to really ask the question, is the universe slowing down or is it accelerating? So supernovae have a distinguished track record in changing our view of the universe.
Can we go back even further and ask Serafina what the Greeks made of these things, the supernovae?
I don't think they were aware of them. I mean, I think they fell under a general umbrella of very strange things that have been observed sometimes. Because between not so much the Greeks, but the Romans, sometimes you find mentions of 3 suns appearing in the sky. That may have been a supernova, for instance. But I don't think they singled them out, as far as I know, as a phenomenon, the way they did eclipses or comets.
Unlike the Chinese.
Yeah.
Would a supernova affect radio transmissions?
Yes.
Because
If it was close enough, back to a big one coming off.
right. It would be nice to think of Aboriginal culture carrying on as normal with a very simple technology, while the more complex technologies are thrown out of kilter.
But before we leave supernovae completely, there is still a debate, at least I'm not aware of it being resolved yet, about why the big one of 1054 wasn't seen in Europe, whether it was cloudy or whether people saw it and thought they'd better ignore it because it would be a bad thing to admit to having seen it. I don't know whether anyone wants to
There was
comment
a
on that.
major church wrangle in that year,
Uh-huh.
1054. Wasn't that where the Orthodox and the Western Christians split? Things getting tacked to the doors of churches, and so maybe that absorbed energies.
Yes, I mean, that could be the case, and they simply ignored it. Because I think if they'd noticed it, one side might have claimed it as a portent to back their case.
Yeah, both sides, probably.
Yes, both sides in different ways.
Yes.
Okay, just before we get on to the UFOs, I did promise we'd get there in the end, and we're getting not too far from the end. We have concentrated exclusively lights in the sky on extra away from the Earth, but just for a moment, can we think about things closer, perhaps the aurora or rainbows? And I mean, I realise they're very different things from what we've been speaking about, but they are lights in the sky, and the influence. Clearly with the aurora, that's only certain parts of the world that would be able to see those, but rainbows, on the other hand, can be seen pretty much from everywhere. So is anyone willing to jump in on that one?
Veronica, I can feel the thought waves coming from her, will want me to mention the ubiquity of the association of serpents with water and rainbows, and it's an extraordinarily widespread phenomenon in many, many cultures.
Would you want to expand on that a little bit?
Veronica knows much more about it than me.
Well, we might take a question on it.
But I tell you what, it is true that early paintings of the rainbow serpent on the north coast of Australia look extraordinarily like Chinese dragons. And minds have been vexed over this question. Again, was it actually overseas contact and the spread of culture, or was it independent invention based on the natural suggestiveness of association of water, rainbows, and serpents? Don't know.
David, do you want to say anything about the religious association of rainbows?
I wish I could, but it's always puzzled me. The classic example of the rainbow is in the Noah story, the Noah account. And although we probably accept it because many of us grew up with it as part of culture and part of childhood, it's really interesting to speculate why the rainbow was interpreted in that kind of way. The link to water is obvious, but there aren't that many Old Testament interpretations of that which is going on in the sky. It's a very unusual thing in the Old Testament to have signs of this kind. Normally they are particular instances of miracles, the burning bush and this type of thing where God is explicitly speaking. But the rainbow is a very unusual one, and I don't know what the origin of that is.
Does it have a Babylonian parallel?
I don't know, Bob. I need to go back. Maybe one of the audience, maybe Veronica will know. I don't know.
The story of Noah has parallels.
It does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
And certainly flood.
It's funny that the Greek and Roman sources I've looked at about rainbows are very, if you like, matter of fact about it. So they all realize it's got to do sun and water. And they got some really interesting proofs, mathematical proofs, that you can never have a circular rainbow. It can only be at maximum semicircular. And then the real problem they have is explaining the colors. Why do you see all these colors? What happens in the eye? But they tend to see it as an issue to do with vision rather than with light. It's not until Newton, I think, that people understand that actually the colors come from the light rather than from the way you perceive, from your eye.
But if we get into experimentalist areas. Obviously, if you're near a waterfall or something, then you can see rainbows, and you might make the association of it not being that different. It could be just a natural phenomena rather than some special thing.
They do that. When I say, they look at it in quite a dispassionate way. They actually say you can produce a rainbow at home. Aristotle has got almost like an experiment because they were aware of that. It wasn't as special as other phenomena.
Can I go to Aurora?
Yes, please do.
I came originally from Northern Ireland, and I remember being woken up to see Aurora in Northern Ireland. And it wasn't that exceptional. I think we have been sold something by travel agents. You have to go to northern Scandinavia or somewhere like that to see Aurora. It's not true. Absolutely not true.
Okay, well, here's one we did earlier, by the way. Look at it later. Okay, I think we've explored those non-extraterrestrial aspects. So let's move on as we're nearing the period when you can ask questions and grill the panel. So let's get to the UFOs finally, and let's not get into alien abductions, etc. Fortunately, we're not in the USA, so I won't do a poll of who's been abducted here. Let's keep it on a higher plane. But why is it, I pose the question, that so many people choose to believe that these particular lights in the sky, the first example of non-natural lights in the sky, are related to extraterrestrials? Is it the Cold War? What do the Chinese make of it? What does the Muslim world make of it? David's written a book on something related, but everyone should contribute.
Well, let me start off. This is a big topic. I mean, I think the way that lights in the sky and unidentified flying objects have been linked to alien visitation probably has its origins in post-World War II. And there's the adaptation of some of the images of rocket technology to these might-be spacecraft. So there's, and then a growing dominance of science fiction, telling the stories in which people then interpret UFOs in that kind of story. I think it also comes from a certain amount of scientific naivety, may I say, a lack of thinking through some of the big questions. I saw a survey the other day which said that 4 million Americans had believed that they'd been abducted by aliens. And I found myself asking the honest question, why do aliens need 4 million Americans? I mean, in one sense. But there's a classic example of this. Enrico Fermi, with a number of colleagues, went for lunch from Los Alamos, and as they walked to lunch, they had a conversation. In the 1950s, this was 1950, there were two stories in the newspapers. One is about flying saucers. People were identifying flying saucers. The other was the mysterious disappearance of trash cans in New York City. And in the New Yorker magazine was a little cartoon linking the two things, that the flying saucers were the reason for taking the trash cans out. And Fermi, with his friends, were talking about this. And then they began to talk about interstellar travel. Fermi became very silent, as he often was. And the conversation went on. They sat down at lunch, and eventually Fermi simply came out with, "Where is everybody?" And that became known as the Fermi Paradox. The fact that if there are aliens liberally sprinkled throughout the galaxy, why haven't they colonized the galaxy? Because the timescale for colonization is very short, maybe 300 million years compared to the 10 billion years of the history of the galaxy. So if they exist, why aren't they here? Now, that's a very simple piece of mathematics to do, and it's a very simple scientific argument to begin to work at. Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist and friend of Fermi, replied to the Fermi Paradox, if they exist, why aren't they here, by saying they are here and they're called Hungarians. That was his response to it. But I think there are some questions where we just haven't talked through the science of this. And finally, I think maybe the other motivation is that they tap into deep, big questions that we find in different cultures. I did a little piece of work a little while ago on the motivations for researchers in SETI and also the people who are part of the UFO community. And you get some common themes. Things like a sense of cosmic loneliness. There must be life out there. A sense of, can we discover cosmic purpose by encountering other life forms? Jung, this sense of cosmic fear or cosmic salvation, that actually aliens would come and deliver us from the mess that we've got ourselves in. In fact, Fred Hoyle had picked that up in a paper in 1949 where he said that the need for some kind of salvation beyond ourselves was part of the motivation for linking lights in the sky to alien visitation.
But is this a very cultural thing? I did throw this in about the Chinese and the Muslim world. I mean, they don't seem to see them, do they? Or we just don't hear about it?
Well, Chinese and Muslim culture have speculated about other worlds. So a plurality of worlds has been very much part of Christian, Chinese and Muslim history. And you can see people speculating about other planets and life on other planets across them all. To my knowledge, I'm not the expert on alien visitation, but I think the dominance of science fiction stories in the West have created the mythology for us to begin to tell stories about alien visitation and all the rest of it.
I think this is a question for you, isn't it? Other cultures.
Yeah, well, I was going to say is that in the ancient Mediterranean, they didn't have aliens because they could, if you like, push this alien into the fringes of the known world because you hadn't explored everything. Then instead of saying, you know, the strange people are in the sky or come from the sky, they could just say, if you go very far north or very far south or east or west, you will find people who have, I don't know, one big foot, and they use it to shade themselves from the sun, or you find people who have their mouths in their chests and so on. And they did all this as a kind of projection of their fears, their desires, what they didn't like with their own culture or world. And it seems to me that's exactly what is happening, except that having explored the Earth, now we have to kind of find the strange elsewhere.
So we're back to Hungarians, basically.
Well, yes, I was going to say that. I think it is striking in the United States that the term alien is used both of spacemen and also for Mexicans or Europeans. And I think that maybe there is a fear of invasion. I also wonder if it isn't a kind of a colonial thing, that we've colonized the rest of the world. Maybe the next thing is these little green men are going to colonize us.
I was hoping to avoid little green men because I know Jocelyn had experience of this in her earlier career. We won't go there. But not that you proposed them, of course. So I'd like to just round this off, I think now, this UFO aspect. And we started off with a personal view from each panellist about what they made of lights in the sky, looking up the stars and so on. So I'd like to just finish off with asking them each in just a few moments to think of a Gedanken experiment. I love that word. I'll say it again. Gedanken experiment. It was a thought experiment. And let's pretend that one of our radio telescopes picks up a signal from another star, say 15 light years away, and we can't decode it because it's in some bizarre format and we just can't do the usual of pretending it's prime numbers. So it's from an intelligent civilization, but we don't know what it says. So would you advise a reply, and what question would you ask if you did? Jocelyn.
I think we're going to find evidence of life on another planet, round another star, certainly within 100 years and maybe within 20 years. Wow. It may not be intelligent life. The odds are it'll be, you know, microbial level life. But I think we're going to find it. And I think we are remarkably unprepared for this. The SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence community, does have some protocols for this. But outside of that community, I think there are big questions we need to think about internationally. You know, if we do pick up what seem to be intelligent signals, do we assume they're friendly or are they dangerous? Are we going to try and go kill them? Eat them, put them in a zoo, The Americans will want to send in the GIs to bring them democracy. There are big, big questions like this, and I think it's high time the world started thinking about these kind of things. So I would pause on doing anything to your signal until humanity had belatedly got its act together.
So we don't know whether to greet them or they're going to eat us, really.
Do we keep quiet? Do we say hi? Or, you know?
Okay, let's move along.
Well, just reminds me rather flippantly of an old joke in Punch, or a group of spacemen shaking hands with a group of little green men, and one of the green men at the back is saying to his friend, if they find out we're made of dark chocolate with a crispy mint filling, we're finished. What I would say is I don't know where I came across this anecdote, but there is a story in Australia of a group of British sailors coming ashore early in the exploration of Australia, a group of Aboriginal people fishing, and the group of Aboriginal fishermen were totally unaware of the presence of the sailors amongst them, until one of the sailors got so irritated by this, he went up and tapped one of the Aboriginal people on the shoulder, and at that point, the guy gave a wild scream and they all ran off. And I just wonder whether signals from another planet somewhere aren't of a similar form, that we won't notice them until they come up and tap us on the shoulder, and then we'll get a terrible shock.
But no one's had a question yet, or perhaps you don't want to pose a question to them, supposedly intelligent.
Are you made of dark chocolate? Yes. No.
So I confess I cheated, because I knew this question was coming, and I asked my 8-year-old son to answer it on my behalf. So he would definitely answer, and he would say, can you come and take me to your planet? In particular, he wants to go with all his friends, obviously, and all the penguins of the world, because he's worried about the ice cap melting. Oh. So this idea is a bit what David was saying, that the aliens can actually save us or give us another chance. It's like, this new promised land where we cannot, we'll end up not making the same mistakes we made with Earth.
So we're hoping for salvation, which brings me to the theologian.
Well, I'm probably a little more positive on this, in the sense that I do believe that there will be some common ground between intelligent life. And it won't be common humanity, but it'll be some kind of common ground on the basis of our understanding of the universe, and for me as a Christian theologian, an experience, however diverse it may be, of a creator God. I think I'd want to ask the question, tell us your story. I think as we encounter difference and diversity, it's if we give space to the other to tell their story, that forms a relationship and builds learning and trust. And I come back to, I'm partly tell me a story because I'm curious about what you believe, how you've developed, how you understand physics, how you understand this, that, and the other. And I think there are dangers. And there are dangers about, mainly from humanity, because we've messed up lots of different environments. But nevertheless, I think curiosity means tell us your story and come and see us.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to cheat and give a very quick answer myself. It will be simpler, but I think there is overlap with yours. I just asked if they've got religion. That's what I want to know. Anyway, we have used the time, and I want to throw it open to the audience. But I'd like to thank our panellists for a very entertaining period of discussion, first of all. Thank you. So it's about 10 or 15 minutes maximum, because there's wine waiting for us downstairs. But we do want to give you, the audience, an opportunity. Is there a roving microphone? There is. There's two, in fact. So hands up. And by the way, you can put it to an individual, the question, or to the panel at large. And try to keep it reasonably brief so we can get a few in, at least. Yeah, Barbara.
We've heard a lot about what we've done wrong and how we hope that maybe the aliens can help us. But I have a question about progress and scientific progress specifically, and understanding things better in the sky. And it's a question to all the panelists, but also perhaps particularly Serafina, because you mentioned one-upmanship. And the fact that in Greco-Roman science you want to do better than your predecessor. But there are many different ways to do better. One is to do better rhetorically, to pull up, to do some trick or to prove someone wrong. Or do we have a sense of scientific, systematic progress, and what does that look like for the Greco-Roman period? And then also a question for the scientists on the panel. How do we understanding better what's happening in the sky, particularly perhaps for you, Jocelyn? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I think in astronomy, and we're lucky that actually astronomy is a bit of a special case, doing better science means coming up with more accurate predictions. One of the main activities of astronomers from Mesopotamia onwards was the production of planetary tables. So texts in tabular format where people would say, the moon is going to appear on a certain day and is going to, set on this other day, and then it's going to reappear on this other day, and so on. And so one of the ways in which, if you like, progress could be measured even, is in producing tables that were more accurate than those of your predecessors. At the same time, there was an acknowledgement that you were standing on your predecessors' shoulders. I read a very nice passage this morning by a Roman intellectual called Seneca, who is probably most famous for committing suicide under the Emperor Nero. He was one of the heroes, if you like, of philosophical resistance. He wrote a whole section of a book about comets. Unlike other people, including Aristotle, he thought that comets were bona fide planetary bodies. And that we just hadn't understood them yet, because their periodicity is so big, they come around, after an interval of so many years, that they didn't have enough observation to observe the periodicity yet. And he says, now, we only understand a few things. We understand more than they did even 150 years ago. He says probably in the future, they will look at what we thought we know, and we'll wonder how we didn't see the things that now they take for granted. And that's a beautiful description of what scientific progress is, as I've come across in a long time.
And I'd say that meshes with contemporary astronomy as well. We have learnt a huge amount, but somehow nature always has the last word. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't understand. When I started in astronomy 40, 50 years ago, we thought that the stuff that we had studied, made up nearly all the universe, 98% or something like that. We now know it makes up 4 or 5% of the universe, and the other 95, 96% is currently unknown and different. And that's as much as we can say about it. So huge progress, yes, but also lots and lots of unexpected things, putting the fat in the fire.
Plenty of PhDs to be done, I think. So, other questions? One at the front, and then I'll get to the back, yeah. It's just here.
Thank you. I love David's question to ask the aliens what their story is, because presumably in their story we're the aliens. And I just wanted to echo what Jocelyn was saying. The enormity of that discovery would change everything for people on this planet. And I wanted to throw it back to Jocelyn to say, what should we be doing to prepare for that moment?
Well, Martin's alluded to the International Astronomical Union, which is not the most agile of bodies.
Better than FIFA.
And there's UNESCO that's not the most agile of bodies, but we do have world bodies that I think should be initiating some of this thinking.
I absolutely agree with that, and now's the time for us to do it. The situation is, again, quite complex. My colleague in Berkeley, Ted Peters, did an interesting survey of 1,300 people of faith communities across Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, and found an interesting effect. That was that most people of faith communities were quite relaxed about the discovery of intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Counterintuitive, that, to the way that we might expect. However, if you ask people outside faith communities how difficult people in faith communities would find it, 68% of those outside faith communities thought that faith communities would have a problem, even though the vast majority of faith communities didn't. So I think this is about us having a public discussion about these kind of issues, openly and honestly, led by certain structures who have the ability to provide a framework for this kind of structure. But it's a subject that lots of people are interested in and would like to talk about and have a sense of ownership of.
Could I put in a plea for there to be an anthropologist on this panel, please?
Yeah. We've had a few questions on ET. It would be nice if we could explore one or two other areas. I'm going to take a couple at the back. Now, there's going to be more than we can cope with, but what I'll do, we are having wine downstairs and the panel are all staying. So if I don't get to you, please don't give up. Just grab them afterwards. Right at the back here.
I think someone's got to ask the principal of St John's College, perhaps as an observation, perhaps as a question, in saying that there wasn't any lights in the sky apart from Noah's rainbow. What about the Star of Bethlehem?
And the sun standing still.
Yes. True. Yes. Both of which I have to plead ignorance, not because I don't know of them, but how to fully interpret them. The appearance of astrology in the birth narratives of Jesus and the star and its significance is one question. It's very difficult to understand against the background of large-scale condemnation of astrology within the rest of the Bible. Then there's the question of, was it a supernova? Was it a planetary conjunction? Was it a comet? All of which have been argued over the years to be the case. Or was it simply a miraculous sign? And different people have argued, and I don't have a firm view on it myself. I have to plead ignorance to that. Sorry, the Star of Bethlehem and...
The sun standing.
Oh, the sun. Oh, yes, thank you, Jocelyn. I have no idea.
No,
I mean, there is an urban legend around, you'll read it on the internet, of NASA astronomers who computed the rotation of the Earth, and they found a 24-hour period that doesn't make sense in their calculations, and this was evidence. I mean, I don't think there's anything to do with that. But again, it's a very unusual occurrence in the biblical narrative, and I don't know what to make of it. So I think I've shown you that I really shouldn't be principal of St John's College in any real way.
But you're a scientist. You can say we don't know.
Well, that's part of theology as well, or should be.
We can do just two more, I think, before we'll have to... one here. Yes, this side.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. As an American visiting student at Durham many years ago, I was issued an alien registration card. Yes. In which they asked me nothing about my record of abductions. But I do have a question. In 1504, Christopher Columbus was in Jamaica, the modern-day Jamaica, in dire straits, and predicted an eclipse, which was shock and awe for the natives, and allegedly convinced them to provide him with more supplies. Cargo cults exist now in Aboriginal Australia, perhaps still, but in Vanuatu and other places. So I'm interested in the political uses of lights in the sky to enforce order, to enforce hegemony over people who have less knowledge of those lights in the sky. Any comments from the panel?
Well, I can comment that in Aboriginal Australia, knowledge is power. And it's much more like knowing industrial patents than it is like academic knowledge. The more you know, the less you tell anyone until they're ready for it. But that does apply in the case of Ngajaya, the supreme deity, but it doesn't apply particularly to lights in the sky. It simply applies to knowledge about the ancestors. And actually, going back to this question of development of empirical knowledge, Aboriginal Australia is a backward-looking culture. It's a question of striving to reproduce the ancestral order. And so older people are automatically better informed. And one of the big empirical question is, did you just hear about this or did you see it for yourself? And that used to come up in land claims quite often.
One last short question. Is there a short one? Let's take this one. Relative? Is it not? Okay. And then the others, I'm afraid, will have to catch them over a glass of wine.
We shall be having a drink.
Yes.
Thanks. I hope it's short. I wanted to ask the panel generally about the role of wonder in looking at the skies. Carl Sagan famously said he thought that the wonder that people felt a long time ago was part of the sort of inspiration that eventually became science. I was sort of motivated to think about this because I remember in 1994 having this feeling. This was when comet Shoemaker-Levy ploughed into Jupiter. And by this stage, I was used to underwhelming astronomical predictions, and I figured this would probably be another one. It would be a damp squib. And I remember seeing some of my first pictures on the internet, seeing the NASA pictures of that happening. It was like the sun was coming up from behind Jupiter. It was extraordinary, and it left behind a hole the size of the world. But I kind of think, I wonder whether some of the wonder that I felt at that was because I knew what was going on, and whether in societies that have a strong mythology about the sky, I wonder whether there is the same impulse to feel wonder about events like this, or whether, you just know that the skies are the way they are. So I wonder whether we get wonder from having some knowledge about the sky, or from having no knowledge, really, about what's up there.
I think the phrase that Carl Sagan used is actually originally Aristotle's. Because he says a philosophy, or rather love of knowledge, is born out of wonder. But the way he puts it is as if wonder also, even when you've understood the phenomenon, your wonder has just been shifted a little further.
Yeah.
So wonder is like, if you like, the boundary of what you yet don't know. And knowing more will just generate more wonder. So it's like the more you know, the more you want to know. Because the wonder never ends, basically.
Perfect answer.
There's,
I think it's a balance. Sorry. No, you carry on.
There's a website I would commend to people called Astronomy Picture of the Day, which contains wonderful photos. Those ones over there are of that sort of caliber. And they're just stunning photographs. Most of them are astronomical. Some of them are terrestrial phenomena. And it sort of stops you and you say, gosh, isn't that gorgeous? And, oh, I wonder how, at least as a scientist, I say, I wonder how, ...
Bob, I think you're going to have the last word on the panel for this question. And
well, no, I was just going to agree with Serafina, actually. I think wonder arises from a certain amount of knowledge, but not having the complete answer. So your attention is pointed towards something that you don't fully understand.
So I'm the only thing standing between you, a glass of wine, and further questions to the panel. I had at one point thought I would try to sum up, but I think this is not a possible thing to do. I feel a bit like Woody Allen, who was, in the context of one of his movies, was asked to summarize War and Peace. And he said, it's about Russia, which I think doesn't do it entire justice. And I don't think I could possibly do the topic justice, so I won't really attempt to. Let me just say a very brief word about what we've tried to do. We may not have succeeded, but interdisciplinarity is all about bringing people together from different areas, having these sort of discussions. They're challenging. Some people think they're too broad, but you have to take out of it what you can, and the main part of it is, I think, to transfer information from one discipline to another and to get a better understanding of the big picture. It sounds rather an obvious statement, but that's what interdisciplinary is about. And I hope we've given you some idea of what the Institute of Advanced Study at Durham does. And we will be here again, or possibly in another venue, maybe here next year, to tell you about our theme called Emergence. So let me just finish before I say thanks to all our helpers. Well, let me do that first, to the audio-visual helpers and the people from the IAS, to leave you with a final link between the lights in the sky. Those of you of a certain age may remember Woodstock, and those of you that don't may still have heard the song by Joni Mitchell. And the thing I leave you with, the thought I leave you with, is we are stardust. Yep. So thank you, everybody, and thanks to the panel. Thank you.